Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk About Cities, a podcast dedicated to making complex topics in architecture and urban design more accessible. In this episode, we'll delve into the rise of populist movements in architecture and how they often exploit simplistic notions of beauty and tradition to promote exclusionary narratives. We'll also examine how architecture has been used as a tool for propaganda throughout history and discuss the dangers of enshrining a specific aesthetic ideology as the official arbiter of good design. Using the reconstruction of the Berlin Palace and the renovation of the Neues Museum as case studies, we'll explore contrasting approaches to historical preservation and their potential implications. Finally, we'll emphasize the importance of engaging with architectural discourse beyond the surface level and call for vigilance against the dangers of populism in shaping our built environment. A big part of the reason I wanted to become an architect was aesthetics. I grew up in a suburb of Stockholm, one of its very first suburbs, in fact, called Aspudden. It was built in the beginning of the 20th century to house working-class people for whom there wasn't enough space in the city proper, inside the toll gates. While other suburbs at the time were mostly built with other urban forms than the inner city, and Aspudden was initially planned for detached houses, what makes it fairly unique is it was ultimately built with a similar block structure as the inner city districts. The buildings were designed in a simple Art Nouveau style, with small parks between them and, because there weren't that many of them, much of the existing landscape with woods, cliffs, hills and valleys remained. In the time since then, the area has been developed much as a microcosm of the architectural development of 20th century Stockholm. In the interwar period, rather functionalist buildings, although still with stucco and slanted roofs and ornamental elements, were placed horizontally along the height contours of the hills, and groups of low towers were placed on the flattened hilltops. It was in one of those functionalist buildings that I was born. Following World War II and the introduction of the subway, Aspudden's expansion continued, characterized by less ornate buildings, flat roofs and straight lines. Towards the neighboring district of Axelsberg, larger slab buildings with dark brown facades made their appearance. In the 1980s, a new ensemble of slightly taller buildings grouped around 3 communal yards took shape on the hilltops overlooking Lake Mälaren on the Eagle Mountain. That's where I lived until I left Stockholm. Because I played football, and the opponents that my team faced were based all over Stockholm, I often ended up in other suburbs I would have otherwise had little reason to visit. And even as a child and later teenager, it was striking to observe how the urban forms and the architectural styles in these areas mirrored the evolution witnessed in Aspudden until the emergence of this new era. As I grew up in the 90s and 2000s, it became evident that a new era had dawned, both for society and architecture. The previously discernible progression of aesthetics, with its emphasis on improved living conditions and harmony with the landscape, seemed to have fractured. Just as Swedish society underwent a socio-economic transformation through deregulation and privatization, embracing globalization, modernity and liberalism, so too did the architectural landscape. In Sweden, the era roughly between the 80s and 2000s was a period of profound transformation. The assassination of Prime Minister Olof Palme in 1986 cast a long shadow, and the country grappled with a deep economic crisis in the early 90s. As Sweden embraced neoliberal policies and integrated further into the globalized economy, traditional social democratic values were challenged, and individualism and consumerism gained prominence. These societal shifts were mirrored in the realm of urban planning and architecture. The previously dominant focus on social welfare and collective gave way to a greater emphasis on market-driven development and individual choice. This manifested in the rise of private developers and a shift away from the public housing projects that had characterized the post-war era. Architecturally, the era saw a departure from the functionalist principles of modernism towards a more diverse and fragmented aesthetic. A generic white box aesthetic emerged, often criticized for its lack of character and disregard for context. Urban planning strategies increasingly emphasize densification and mixed-use development, driven by concerns about sprawl and a desire to create vibrant and economically competitive cities. However, this focus on density also raised concerns about affordability and social equity, and also about the potential for a generic and homogenized urban landscape. Across Stockholm and beyond, I witnessed the construction of simplistic buildings with flat, bright facades that seemed to disregard their surroundings. They were imposed upon the landscape rather than integrated into it, and were surrounded by grey asphalt and concrete. This perceived aesthetic dissonance fueled my desire to become an architect. It was an instinctive response, a yearning to counteract what I saw as the aesthetic destruction of my environment. I can therefore very well empathize with critics of modern architecture who decry the prevalence of box architecture, even if the use of colors and materials has become somewhat more varied. When something is seen as a threat, even if just aesthetically, it's perhaps natural that the counter-reaction comes in the forms of revolts or uprisings. The first such group I know of is the British Architectural Revival, a Facebook group formed in 2012. Their profile description is, "In an age of ugliness, a work of beauty is an act of defiance. Tradition, not modernism, is the future." The text has iron crosses on either side of it, which is a bit strange and possibly, although not necessarily, problematic, as is the phrase proclaiming tradition as future. I'll get back to that later in the episode. A Swedish group inspired by architectural revival, calling themselves Arkitekturupproret, or the Architectural Uprising, was created in 2014, and it's expanded with charters in several European countries. I remember only some initial murmurings about them at the time, but since then they've achieved some degree of influence in the Swedish architectural discourse. One major reason for that is the relative lack of a Swedish architectural discourse in the first place, making it easy to claim space within it. Compared to other countries in which I've lived, Denmark and Austria, architecture just doesn't seem to be as important or culturally relevant to the general public in Sweden. So what is the Architectural Uprising actually criticizing? On the English language page of their Swedish website, they state 3 main grievances. 1. The blatant disregard from both developers, architects, and government for what people want, for what is healthy, emotionally nourishing, and socially sustainable. The second grievance is being offered the false dichotomy of A. Overpriced neo-modernism in 50 Shades of Grey, major developer's choice, B. Overly playful deconstructionism, narcissistic architect's choice, or C. A depressing combination of the two, where the developer lets the architect decorate a boring box with clashing primary colors, randomly placed windows and balconies, or scaled up patterns with no connection to the shape, color, or style of the building. The third grievance defined is the continued destruction of our cultural heritage in the form of A. Resumed demolitions of 18th and 19th century buildings, which is especially shocking after the massive self-destruction of our city centers in the 50s and 60s, and B. The building of new, brutally contrasting infills, additions, and ugly high-rises in historical quarters, popular parks, picturesque medieval towns, and other sensitive areas. I think those grievances at face value are all quite fair. They're very similar to my perception as a child of an aesthetic destruction of my environment. So, to begin with, I will comment on them at face value. First of all, developers, architects, and the government are not one homogeneous group, and it's dishonest to portray them as such in order to position them as enemies of the people. While public participation in shaping the built environment is crucial, solely prioritizing popular opinion risks overlooking the complexities of architectural design and urban planning. Architects, developers, and planners possess specialized knowledge and expertise, and their role extends beyond simply catering to immediate aesthetic preferences. There are, however, clear issues here with unfettered market-driven development. If it helps the bottom line, corners will be cut and quality will be compromised. Who buys an apartment based on the beauty of the facade? And for the second grievance, it's a gross generalization to say that there's only the dichotomy of neo-modernism, which is an underdeveloped term, and deconstructionism, which is essentially played out and was a niche phenomenon. Doing so ignores the multitude of other styles and influences that shape the contemporary architectural landscape, and it doesn't engage with why or from where trends emerge and gain prominence. The architectural uprising offers a simplistic binary of beautiful and ugly, positioning their own preference for traditional architecture, which is in itself an incredibly simplified notion, as the universal good. When it comes to the preservation of cultural heritage, that's undoubtedly important, but it shouldn't be an excuse to stifle progress or impose a narrow definition of what actually constitutes valuable architecture. A balanced approach is needed, one that respects the past while also embracing the potential of contemporary design to create meaningful and inspiring spaces for future generations. That involves thoughtful interventions that respect historical context while also introducing new layers of meaning and functionality. Beyond cultural heritage, demolishing functioning older buildings is highly questionable because of their embodied energy and the emissions associated with having built them. To combat climate change, it's essential to adapt and reuse what's already been built, rather than demolish it and build new resource-costly structures. That's a perspective which is becoming very well established in the architectural discourse, but it also needs to be enforced by the government and adopted by developers. Developing a critical eye is essential for moving beyond the layperson's view. This involves actively engaging with the built environment, questioning design choices, and considering the social, cultural, and historical context within which buildings and spaces are created. It also requires reading works dealing with those contexts. By cultivating a deeper understanding of the multifaceted nature of architecture, we can move beyond superficial judgments and appreciate the profound impact that the built environment has on our lives. Leaving Stockholm to study architecture in Umeå marked a significant step in my own architectural journey. Immersed in a new environment and surrounded by peers who shared my passion for the built environment, I began to question and expand upon the simplistic understanding of aesthetics that I had applied to the environment I grew up within in Aspudden. Through engaging with diverse architectural theories and philosophies, I came to appreciate the multifaceted nature of the discipline. I learned that architecture isn't merely about facades, but about the creation of spaces that shape human experience. The arrangement of walls, openings, and volumes orchestrates a choreography of movement, light, and shadow, influencing our emotions and our perceptions. A well-designed space can evoke feelings of awe, tranquility, or intimacy, while a poorly designed one can leave us feeling disoriented or oppressed. Beyond aesthetics, I discovered the vital role of functionality and performance in architecture. Buildings have to provide shelter, accommodate specific activities, and respond to the needs of their users. Considerations of structural integrity, environmental performance, and accessibility are essential aspects of architectural design. A building that's visually striking but fails to function effectively ultimately falls short of its purpose. Moreover, I came to understand that architecture is deeply intertwined with social and cultural values. Buildings and urban spaces reflect the beliefs, aspirations, and power dynamics of the societies that create them. They can serve as symbols of identity, power, or community, and their design can either reinforce or challenge existing social norms. Furthermore, I learned to appreciate the importance of historical context and continuity in architecture. Each building is situated within a historical lineage, drawing inspiration from and responding to the architectural traditions that came before it. Understanding this historical context enriches our appreciation of a building's significance, and it also allows us to trace the evolution of architectural styles and ideas. Through this process of critical engagement and exploration, I moved beyond my own initial binary focus on beauty and ugliness, and I developed a more nuanced understanding of architectural aesthetics. I recognized that aesthetic preferences aren't merely subjective, but actually influenced by cultural norms, historical context, and personal experiences. This diversity of perspectives enriches the architectural discourse, and it encourages a deeper appreciation for the underlying principles and intentions that inform design choices. Expecting the general public to possess the same level of architectural expertise as professionals is both unfair and unrealistic. Most people don't have the time, resources, or inclination to delve into the complexities of architectural theory, structural engineering, or urban planning. Their understanding of architecture is primarily shaped by their everyday experiences and interactions with the built environment. And that often translates into a focus on aesthetics, as it's the most readily accessible aspect of architecture for the layperson. Despite their lack of specialized knowledge, lay people have valuable insights to offer. They're the ones who ultimately use and experience the spaces that architects and planners design. Their perspectives on issues such as livability, accessibility, and community needs are essential for creating truly successful and inclusive built environments. The challenge lies in bridging the gap between professional expertise and public engagement. This requires architects and planners to communicate complex architectural concepts in a clear and accessible manner, avoiding jargon and technical language that can alienate the public. Instead of simply presenting predetermined plans, professionals should engage in genuine dialogue with communities, actively listening to their concerns and aspirations. By providing opportunities for public education and engagement, architects and planners can empower communities to participate in planning processes in a more informed and meaningful way. It's also essential to acknowledge and respect the diversity of perspectives that exist within the public realm. There's no single correct way to experience or appreciate architecture, and professionals should be open to different viewpoints and interpretations. Respecting the layperson's perspective doesn't mean simply catering to popular opinion or resorting to simplistic solutions. Architects and planners have a responsibility to balance public input with their own expertise and professional judgment. That involves maintaining professional integrity, providing context and expertise to public discussions, and facilitating informed decision-making. By bridging the gap between professional expertise and public engagement, architects and planners can create architecture that's both aesthetically pleasing and responsive to the needs of its users. Respecting the layperson's perspective, communicating effectively, fostering dialogue, and avoiding populism are crucial steps towards creating inclusive and successful built environments that benefit all members of society. As we discussed in the episode on participative planning, there have long been initiatives for increased public participation in planning, and it's increasingly commonly adopted by local governments. But there are still barriers and dishonest use of the idea of participation. We discussed many of them in that episode, and if you haven't listened to it, I recommend looking it up or reading the transcript on our website. Something we didn't mention in that episode, but have touched on in this one, is populist rhetoric, and frankly, the use of aesthetics as propaganda. Populism often relies on simplistic narratives that pit the people against the elite, and the architectural uprisings rhetoric frequently employs that strategy. By framing architects, developers, and government as a monolithic entity that disregards public preferences, they create a false dichotomy that can fuel resentment and division. That approach can be dangerous as it simplifies complex issues and undermines the possibility of nuanced and constructive dialogue. Furthermore, the architectural uprising's emphasis on aesthetics as the primary criterion for judging architecture is problematic. While aesthetics are undoubtedly an important aspect of the built environment, reducing architectural criticism to just a question of beauty versus ugliness overlooks the crucial roles of functionality, sustainability, and social responsibility. The simplistic approach can be easily manipulated to serve ideological agendas, as evidenced by historical examples of architecture being used as propaganda. The uprising's focus on aesthetics often aligns with a nostalgic yearning for a romanticized past, overlooking the complexities and inequalities that existed within those historical contexts. This nostalgia can be exploited to promote exclusionary narratives that pit traditional values against the perceived threat from diverse and evolving cultural expressions. This approach bears resemblance to the identity politics often employed by right-wing movements. Instead of engaging with the complex structural issues of contemporary societies, such as economic inequality, climate change, and social justice, the focus is shifted towards superficial markers of identity like ethnicity, religion, and sexual orientation. That creates a narrative of an us versus them dynamic, fueling fear and division within the society. The architectural uprising describes itself as being ideologically unaligned, which is difficult to square with the traditionalist tastes and values. They appear at the very least to be ideologically conservative, although that's not to claim that they have a particular political affiliation. The points they make have been taken on board by political parties across the board, for example in the municipalities of Gothenburg and Upplands Väsby, where politicians have made demands for classical styles in new developments. However, as populists tend to do, the right-wing Swedish Democrats have identified the potential value to them of adopting the ideas of the uprising. As their longtime chief ideologue described their view on architecture in relation to their opposites, quote, "I think they're trying to break away from tradition and history. They want to show that everyone is equal by making everything look the same, without any frills or decorations. I disagree with this approach. I think we need to bring our history and traditions with us into the future. I also think that most people prefer buildings that are aesthetically pleasing. A house with ornamentation and details that connect it to the history of its place is more beautiful than a square concrete box with smooth surfaces and identical windows. The type of cultural conservatism that I stand for is new. It's a spiritual perspective that focuses on virtues and beauty, on a sense of home and identity." End quote. Here again is the simplification of aesthetics into styles, manipulated to serve ideological agendas. Michael Diamant, a co-founder of the architectural uprising and founder of the similar group New Traditional Architecture, says, quote, "People have the right to be angry because all the ugliness they see is on purpose, and if we speak out, we're called conservative." End quote. Or the chairman of the association run by the uprising, Sigvald Freylander, when asked if he saw any issues with extensive online harassment and publication of architects' home addresses, quote, "That's a subjective judgment, but let me put it this way. Who started the provocations? Someone put up this ugly building, which I'm forced to live with. It's a provocation that we're responding to." End quote. While the architectural uprising claims to be ideologically unaligned, certain actions and associations raise questions about that assertion. For instance, the co-founder Michael Diamant has written guest articles for Det Goda Samhället, or The Good Society, a website known for its association with far-right and nationalist viewpoints. In one such article, titled Swedish Renaissance, with the Swedish architecture people will identify with Swedish culture, Diamant argues for a return to traditional Swedish architectural styles, linking it to national identity and cultural preservation. He even states that the modern architecture that has been built in Sweden since the 1930s is a foreign element in our country, framing modern architecture as inherently incompatible with Swedish culture. In the article comments, he expresses the need for remigration of immigrants. This type of rhetoric is used to promote a narrow and exclusionary definition of Swedish culture, fueling a nationalist sentiment. It promotes ethno-cultural homogeneity or purity, coupled with an acceptance of anger and online harassment as a response to provocation. It's firmly within fascist tradition. It's crucial to recognize that the manipulation of architectural styles for ideological purposes isn't a new phenomenon. The historical relationship between National Socialism and modernism serves as a stark example. In Nazi Germany, culture played a crucial role in disseminating the Nazi worldview and ideology. Art, architecture, and design were co-opted and manipulated to serve as powerful propaganda tools. The notion that the Nazis were simply against modernism is an oversimplification that fails to capture the complex and calculated ways they approached and exploited various artistic movements. The infamous Degenerate Art, or Entartete Kunst exhibition, is often cited as evidence of the Nazis' outright rejection of modern art, but this exhibition must be understood within its broader context. Much of the artwork deemed degenerate was created by Jewish artists, leftists, or those associated with ideologies that the Nazis targeted as the supposed causes of Germany's perceived misery during the 1920s. The exhibition wasn't solely driven by aesthetic preferences, but rather served as a means to demonize and marginalize specific groups, reinforcing the Nazis' racist and anti-Semitic agenda. The Nazis' approach to the Bauhaus design school further illustrates their complex and often contradictory stance on modernism. While they criticized the school's perceived internationalism, rootlessness, and associations with Jewish and Bolshevik members, they didn't entirely reject its functionalist principles. Under the leadership of Mies van der Rohe, the Bauhaus embraced a thoroughly apolitical and abstract modernist style, characterized by white walls, steel, glass, and flat roofs. And that international style initially faced criticism from the Nazis, who deemed it un-German. But the response wasn't monolithic. Hitler himself hadn't yet solidified his architectural preferences, and he was initially influenced by his propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels recognized the potential symbolic power of modernism and its ability to represent progress. In 1933, Hitler spoke at a cultural conference where he criticized radical art, but expressed acceptance of functionalism in design. This openness stemmed in part from Hitler's admiration for industrialism and technology, and those are qualities that he shared with Mies van der Rohe's modernist vision. It wasn't until Hitler's close collaboration with the classically trained architect Albert Speer that the architectural aesthetic of the Nazi regime took a decisive turn. Speer indulged Hitler's taste for sentimental nationalist architecture, leading to the adoption of a bombastic neoclassical style characterized by inflated porticos, pediments, columns, and cheap analogies with the Roman Empire. This grandiose aesthetic became the defining architectural language of the Third Reich, serving as a means to construct a false sense of historical continuity and to glorify the regime's supposed connection to an idealized Aryan heritage. But alongside this embrace of neoclassicism, the Nazis also promoted a romanticized vision of traditional German vernacular architecture. Idealized depictions of rural life, craftsmanship, and a mythical connection between German blood and soil fueled the Nazis' völkisch ideology of racial purity and rejection of foreign influences. In essence, the Nazi regime's relationship with modernism was far more nuanced and manipulative than a blanket rejection. Their approach was driven by a pragmatic desire to weaponize culture as a means of propagating their racist and nationalist ideologies. Modern art and architecture were selectively embraced, criticized, or co-opted based on their perceived ability to reinforce the Nazi worldview and consolidate power. This calculated exploitation of culture serves as a powerful reminder of how artistic movements can be distorted and instrumentalized by authoritarian regimes to further their oppressive agendas. In the contemporary context, we see similar attempts to influence architectural aesthetics through political means. The Trump administration's executive order from December 2020, entitled Promoting Beautiful Federal Civic Architecture, reignited debates around state intervention in cultural spheres and how the built environment can be weaponized to promote certain ideological visions. The executive order made classical revival and traditional architectural styles derived from Greek and Roman antiquity the preferred mode for all new federal courthouses, agency headquarters, and public buildings over $50 million in Washington, D.C. and across the country. It portrayed these styles as uniquely capable of uplifting public spaces, inspiring the human spirit, and commanding respect in a way that embodies American democratic ideals of dignity, vigor, and stability. In contrast, the order was hugely dismissive of modernist architecture trends of the 20th century, deeming them wildly unpopular with the public. It encouraged agencies to look into redesigning existing modernist federal buildings to align with the preferred classical styles as well. And it required soliciting input from local communities before choosing architectural firms, under the justification of respecting regional preferences. That policy actively shapes the cultural landscape by legislating a very specific aesthetic ideology as representative of a national identity. And in doing so, it constructs a divide between an implied us, public whose tastes it claims to champion through tradition, versus a cultural elite associated with modernist styles portrayed as alienating and dissonant. The language demonizes iconic modernist federal buildings like the brutalist Hubert H. Humphrey's HHS building as ugly, unpopular, and unidentifiable as civic in the eyes of the so-called general public. This general public is even carefully defined to exclude anyone affiliated with arts, architecture, academia, or related professions. So the order positions itself as the populist arbiter of true mainstream aesthetic values. Claims the elite institutional world of modernist architecture has been ignoring public sensibilities for too long in favor of pleasing insular artistic circles. It constructs an us versus them cultural battlefield where the righteous people's tastes are pitted against out-of-touch bureaucrats and artsy avant-garde types. Classical beauty is the designated legitimate expression of public identities and regional traditions. But we have to interrogate whose specific tastes and traditions are being centered here as the true public in a socio-culturally diverse nation. Privileging of Western classical ideals and denigration of modernism does seem to map along ethno-nationalist fault lines. For all its appeals to public tastes and regional identities, the order still makes a top-down value judgment that traditions rooted in Greek democracy and Roman imperial grandeur are inherently superior conduits for American civic values. It reflects a cultural conservatism that is deeply intertwined with narratives of Western civilizational identity. So, in regulating architectural culture, The state inserts itself as an arbiter of legitimacy, curating a highly particular aesthetic emblematic of a specific ideological vision. There are deeper questions around whether the general public actually prefers classical beauty in federal architecture, or if that reflects elite assumptions. The unanimity implied by the public may simply drown out diverse perspectives. Moreover, enshrining cultural ideological principles in law inevitably injects a stifling element into creative spheres. Even with allowances for non-classical styles in extraordinary cases, the heavy thumb on the scale could limit public architecture's ability to organically evolve and to reinterpret the built environment for new social contexts. The built environment we inhabit inevitably symbolizes the ideologies and power structures that shape it. This executive order represents a concerted effort to harness the semiotics of classical architecture as a vessel for disseminating a traditionalist vision of national identity. It serves as a stark reminder that architecture has long been co-opted as an instrument for promulgating political ideologies, whether oppressive or inspirational, through the sagacious hand of the state. The appointment in 2018 of Roger Scruton to lead the UK government's Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission on promoting better design for housing and public spaces reignited long-simmering architecture culture wars in Britain. To architectural critics and many in the profession, Scruton represented a throwback to the tedious and unproductive style battles of the 1980s between staunch traditionalists and modernists. Scruton's appointment also faced alarm on an additional front. MPs demanded his resignation based on comments such as stating that there is no such crime as date rape, calling homosexuality not normal, and denouncing Islamophobia as an invented concept. Luciana Berger of the Jewish labor movement also urged him to step down, arguing some of his remarks reinforce anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about the philanthropist George Soros. Scruton also wrote articles promoting smoking without disclosing he was being paid by a tobacco company as late as the early 2000s. Roger Scruton was a vehement proponent of vernacular architecture, adhering strictly to classical styles derived from Greek and Roman precedents. He ardently denigrated modernist and contemporary designs as ruthless disruptors of communities and historical continuity. In doing so, he ignores the more nuanced realities of how architectural movements have evolved. His blinkered critique paints with an excessively broad brush, falsely portraying modernists as universally indifferent to beauty or ignorant of historical context. Characterizations like that are ahistorical, and they're detached from the substantive debates within the profession itself over urban renewal successes and failures in the post-war era. Crucially, Scruton's professed mission to protect vernacular aesthetics and popular taste from alienating avant-garde architecture is littered with cherry-picked anecdotes, fatuous generalizations, and a refusal to acknowledge counter-narratives. His dogmatic views leave no room for the myriad housing developments that have matured into thriving, beloved communities, defying his dismissal of anything but classical recreation. By enshrining a specific subjective aesthetic ideology as the official arbiter of good design, Scruton's appointment raises concerns about reinforcing exclusionary cultural hegemonies under the guise of populism. Whose experiences, histories, and identities get centered as authentically representing the people. There are valid fears that a privileging of Western classical traditions could functionally marginalize architectural styles originating from other contexts. This echoes a broader pattern of populist movements, defining an idealized national us in ethno-nationalist terms that alienate minority populations. Narrowly equating beauty with mimicry of ancient Greco-Roman architecture promotes monolithic cultural conformity, very ill-suited to pluralistic societies. Moreover, Scruton's professed reverence for fitting in and suppressing architectural ego can serve as a convenient cover for restricting open expression and pressuring the creative dynamism that allowed past styles like Georgian architecture organically emerge, and redefine aesthetics could be stifled under his conception of good design, solely replicating ossified historical forms. While arguments around cohesive urban planning and learning from successful traditional models contain some merit, Scruton's polemical framing misdirects scrutiny away from more systemic policy failures contributing to shoddy development. His facile broadsides against abstract bogeymen like utopian architects provide an easy distraction from examining root causes like profit-driven volume house builders, deregulation, or racially motivated urban planning. The reconstruction of the Berlin Palace on the Museumsinsel stands as a potent symbol of the complex and often contentious relationship between architecture, history, and national identity. Destroyed during World War II and subsequently demolished by the East German government, the palace has been resurrected in a project that has sparked heated debates about historical authenticity, cultural memory, and the role of architecture in shaping national narratives. The decision to rebuild the palace wasn't without controversy. Critics questioned the wisdom of investing vast sums of public money in a project that seemed more concerned with replicating the past than engaging with the challenges of the present. Notably, several prominent donors with right-wing affiliations have contributed significant sums to the project, raising concerns about the potential influence of their ideology on the palace's design and symbolism. One such donor is the billionaire August von Fink, known for his support of conservative and right-wing causes. He donated 10 million euros towards the reconstruction of the palace's Baroque facade, a gesture that's been interpreted by some as an attempt to promote a specific traditionalist vision of German identity. Another controversial figure associated with the project is Wilhelm von Bodien, the founder of the Berlin Palace Initiative, which has been instrumental in raising funds for the reconstruction. While not directly affiliated with any political party, von Bodien has expressed views that align with right-wing ideology, including a romanticized view of Prussian history and a desire to restore Germany's national pride. The involvement of these donors has fueled concerns that the Berlin Palace project is being used to promote a narrow and exclusionary vision of German identity, one that's rooted in a nostalgic yearning for a bygone era. Critics argue that this approach risks whitewashing the more problematic aspects of German history, such as Prussian militarism and colonialism. Proponents of the reconstruction, on the other hand, saw it as an opportunity to reclaim a lost symbol of German history and identity. They argued that the palace represented a vital link to the country's cultural heritage, and that its reconstruction would serve as a powerful symbol of national unity and renewal. The architectural approach adopted for the reconstruction further fueled the debate. The decision to faithfully replicate the palace's original Baroque facade while incorporating a modern interior has been criticized as a pastiche, a superficial imitation that lacks the authenticity and historical integrity of the original structure. Critics argue that this approach represents a form of architectural Disneyfication, prioritizing a romanticized image of the past over genuine historical engagement. But supporters of the reconstruction defend the decision to prioritize historical accuracy in the facade. They argue that it allows the palace to reclaim its symbolic significance and serve as a tangible reminder of Germany's complex and often troubled past. They see the modern interior as a way to ensure that the building is functional and relevant to contemporary needs, bridging the gap between historical preservation and modern functionality. In contrast to the Berlin Palace reconstruction, David Chipperfield's renovation of the Neues Museum on the Museumsinsel offers a more nuanced and critical approach to the challenges of preserving and reinterpreting historical buildings. Rather than simply replicating the original structure, Chipperfield chose to preserve the existing building while incorporating contemporary elements. That approach acknowledges the building's history while also making it relevant to contemporary needs. The Neues Museum was severely damaged during World War II and remained in a state of disrepair for decades. Chipperfield's renovation, which was completed in 2009, aimed to restore the building's original grandeur while also creating a space that could accommodate modern museum practices. One of the key features of Chipperfield's approach is the careful preservation of the building's original fabric. Damaged walls and columns were repaired and stabilized, and original architectural details were meticulously restored. This meticulous attention to detail allows visitors to experience the building's history firsthand. But then Chipperfield also incorporated contemporary elements into the renovation. For example, a new grand staircase was added to improve the circulation, and modern exhibition spaces were created to house the museum's collection. Those contemporary interventions are designed to be respectful of the original architecture, ensuring that the building's historical character isn't overshadowed. The Neues Museum renovation also stands out for its emphasis on historical awareness and critical reflection. The project acknowledges the building's complex past, including its use during the Nazi era. This critical engagement with history sets the Neues Museum apart from the Berlin Palace project, which has been criticized for potentially whitewashing the more problematic aspects of German history. The Berlin Palace project raises important questions about the role of architecture in shaping national narratives. Can the reconstruction of a historical building truly recapture the spirit of a bygone era? Or does it inevitably result in a sanitized and romanticized version of the past? How can we balance the desire to preserve cultural heritage with the need to create buildings that are relevant and meaningful to contemporary society? These questions are particularly pertinent in the context of the broader discussion about populism and aesthetics in architecture. As we've seen, populist movements often exploit simplistic notions of beauty and tradition to promote exclusionary narratives and fuel nationalist sentiment. The Berlin Palace project, with its emphasis on historical accuracy and national symbolism, risks being co-opted by such agendas. It's crucial to approach the reconstruction of historical buildings with a critical and nuanced perspective. While preserving cultural heritage is definitely important, it shouldn't come at the expense of historical accuracy or critical engagement with the past. Architects and planners have a responsibility to ensure that such projects aren't merely exercises in nostalgia, but opportunities to foster meaningful dialogue about history, identity, and the role of architecture in shaping our collective memory. As I record this, the stock exchange in Copenhagen is just burnt down, and it'll be very interesting to see how that's dealt with, seeing as Copenhagen is something of a hub for modern architecture. Throughout this episode, we've explored the complex and often contentious relationship between architecture, aesthetics, and populism. We've seen how populist movements can exploit simplistic notions of beauty and tradition to promote exclusionary narratives and fuel nationalist sentiment. The examples of the Berlin Palace project and the Neues Museum highlight the importance of engaging with architectural discourse beyond the surface level. While aesthetics are undoubtedly an important aspect of the built environment, reducing architectural criticism to a question of beauty versus ugliness overlooks the crucial roles of functionality, sustainability, and social responsibility. It's essential to cultivate a critical eye and to question the underlying ideologies and intentions that inform design choices. By engaging with the built environment in a thoughtful and informed manner, we can move beyond superficial judgments and appreciate the profound impact that architecture has on our lives. Furthermore, we have to remain vigilant against the dangers of populism. Populist rhetoric often seeks to simplify complex issues and create false dichotomies. In the realm of architecture, that can manifest in the form of simplistic narratives that pit traditional aesthetics against modern designs. Such narratives can be easily manipulated to serve exclusionary agendas and undermine the possibility of nuanced and constructive dialogue. By engaging with architectural discourse in a critical and informed manner, we can resist the temptation of populism and promote a more inclusive and equitable built environment. Let's talk about cities.